I cannot predict exactly when it will end, but I want to make some very clear predictions about what comes next, especially as we approach 2027. Okay. So before we understand what comes next, we first need to understand what Pax Americana actually is, and more importantly, how it is already starting to break down. Alright. So when people talk about Pax Americana, what they really mean is a system. It's not just military power. It's not just the United States being strong. It's a global system where the United States guarantees security, guarantees trade, and guarantees stability. And in return, the rest of the world accepts American leadership. Okay, that's the deal. Now, this system worked very well for a long time. After the Cold War, especially, there was no real competitor. The United States could project power anywhere in the world. It controlled the seas. It controlled the financial system. It controlled the narrative, and because of that, most countries didn't challenge it. They benefited from it. All right. But now let's look at what's actually happening. Because if you listen to policymakers, if you listen to media, they will tell you that Pax Americana is still strong, that the United States is still the dominant power. But if you look at the reality on the ground, what you see is something very different. Okay. So let's take a step back. What serious analysts have been arguing for quite some time is that empires don't collapse suddenly. They decay, they erode. And most importantly, they lose the ability to maintain the system that they themselves created. Alright. So what does that mean in practice? It means that the United States is no longer able to enforce the rules of the system consistently. In some regions, yes. In others, no. And that inconsistency is the beginning of the end. Because once countries realize that the system is no longer guaranteed, they start making different decisions. Okay. So what I want to do now is examine the current situation. Not in terms of headlines, not in terms of what people are saying, but in terms of how the system actually functions, because once you understand that, you can start to see what comes next. Alright. So let's look at global trade. The entire global economy depends on secure shipping lanes. It depends on the ability to move goods across oceans without disruption. And for decades, the United States Navy has guaranteed that. That's been the foundation of globalization. But now, what's happening is that those shipping lanes are becoming contested. You have regional powers that are capable of disrupting them. You have non-state actors using cheap technologies like drones and missiles to challenge them. And most importantly, you have the United States being unable to respond everywhere at once. Okay? So what that means is that the guarantee is no longer absolute. It's conditional. And once it becomes conditional, the entire system starts to change. Now let's look at the financial system. The US dollar has been the backbone of Pax Americana. It's not just a currency, it's a tool of power. It allows the United States to sanction countries, to control global liquidity, to influence economies around the world. But what's happening now is that more and more countries are looking for alternatives, not because they want to overthrow the system, but because they no longer trust it. They see that the system can be weaponized. They see that access can be restricted, and so they start building parallel systems. Alright? So again, this is not a sudden collapse. This is a gradual shift, but it's very important. Now, let's talk about the military dimension because this is where most people focus. They think Pax Americana is about aircraft carriers, about bases, about firepower. And yes, that's part of it. But the real question is not whether the United States is strong. The real question is whether it can achieve its objectives. And increasingly, what we see is that it cannot. It can project power, but it cannot control outcomes. It can win battles, but it struggles to win wars. And more importantly, it struggles to shape the political and economic environment after those conflicts. Okay, so now I want to go deeper on something that most analysts miss entirely, and that is the domestic dimension, because Pax Americana was not just an external system. It was also an internal bargain. The United States told its own population that global leadership brought prosperity, that bases abroad kept them safe, that alliances made them stronger. And for a while that was true, or at least it was believed. But now significant parts of the American population have stopped believing it. They look at decades of foreign policy and they ask a very simple question. What do we get from this? What did the average American actually gain from maintaining a global empire? And that question has no good answer because the gains from Pax Americana were concentrated. They went to financial institutions, to multinational corporations, to defense contractors. The average American got cheap consumer goods and not much else. And when even that started to erode, when jobs went overseas, when wages stagnated, when communities collapsed, the domestic legitimacy of the entire project began to crack. Right? So this is crucial because when a system loses its domestic legitimacy, it cannot be sustained by external power alone. You cannot maintain an empire when your own population has stopped believing in it. Not in a democracy, not over the long term. And what you're seeing now in American politics is the very visible symptom of that internal collapse. The arguments about NATO funding, the skepticism about foreign aid, the debates about whether alliances are worth their cost. These are not just political arguments, they are expressions of a deeper structural shift. The domestic consensus that once supported Pax Americana is fracturing. Okay, so now let's bring that back to the external picture, because when domestic support weakens, foreign policy becomes inconsistent. Commitments become unreliable. Allies start to question whether the guarantee is real. And adversaries start to probe the limits of what they can get away with. And this is exactly what we are seeing right now. Allies in Europe are quietly building their own defense capacities. Countries in the Middle East are hedging, maintaining relationships with both Washington and its rivals. Asian powers are recalculating their exposure. Nobody wants to be the last one standing on a platform that is being quietly dismantled. Now, let's look at something else that rarely gets discussed, and that is the information dimension. Because Pax Americana was not just military and economic, it was also ideological. The United States did not just dominate the world. It sold a story about that domination. It called it the liberal international order. It called it rules-based. It called it beneficial for everyone. And for decades, that story was powerful. Other countries accepted it, or at least did not openly challenge it, because the alternative was uncertain and the costs of resistance were high. But that story is now crumbling. And what's interesting is that it's not crumbling because of enemy propaganda, although that plays a role. It's crumbling because of contradictions in the American position itself. You cannot tell the world you believe in international law and then exempt yourself from it. You cannot call yourself the defender of sovereignty and then decide whose sovereignty matters and whose doesn't. These contradictions have been visible for a long time, but they are now impossible to ignore, all right? And this matters enormously because when you lose the narrative, you lose legitimacy. And when you lose legitimacy, you have to rely more and more on coercion. And coercion is expensive. It breeds resistance, and eventually it becomes unsustainable. Okay, so now let's tie all of this together. What I'm describing is not one crisis. It's a convergence of crises. A military system that can project force but cannot control outcomes. A financial system that is being slowly worked around. A domestic population that has lost confidence in the imperial project. And an ideological framework that has lost its credibility. Any one of these in isolation would be a serious problem. Together they are something much more fundamental. They represent the structural end of a specific kind of global order. So now that we understand this, we can start asking the real question. If the system is breaking down, what replaces it? And this is where things get very interesting, because most people assume that if Pax Americana ends, it'll be replaced by another dominant power. Maybe China, maybe some other country. But that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is fragmentation, right? So instead of one global system, what we're seeing is the emergence of multiple regional systems, each with its own rules, its own power dynamics, its own alliances. And these systems don't necessarily align with each other. So for example, in one region you might have a system dominated by economic integration. In another you might have a system dominated by security concerns. In another you might have a system driven by ideology. And these systems interact, but they don't form a single coherent order. Okay. So this is the first major shift from a unified global system to a fragmented multipolar world. Now the second shift is even more important, and that is the shift from stability to volatility. Under Pax Americana, the system was relatively stable. Conflicts existed, but they were contained. They were managed. They didn't disrupt the entire system. But in a fragmented world, conflicts become more frequent and more unpredictable because there is no single power capable of enforcing limits. There is no overarching authority. So regional conflicts can escalate, they can spill over. They can affect global systems in ways that were previously controlled. Alright, so what does this mean for 2027 specifically? It means that by that point these trends will have accelerated. You will see more countries acting independently. You will see more alliances shifting. You will see more economic fragmentation. And most importantly, you will see a decline in the ability of any single power to manage the system. Okay, so now let's examine the strategic implications of this. The first is that countries will prioritize resilience over efficiency. Under Pax Americana, the system was optimized for efficiency, global supply chains, just-in-time production, open trade. But in a fragmented world, that becomes risky. So countries start localizing production. They start building redundancy. They start securing resources. And this makes the global economy less efficient but more resilient. The second implication is that power becomes more localized. Instead of global dominance, you have regional dominance. And that means that smaller powers can have more influence within their regions, even if they cannot compete globally. The third implication is the narrative dimension, because under Pax Americana, there was a dominant narrative, a belief in globalization, in liberal order, in shared progress. But as the system fragments, so does the narrative. Different regions develop different narratives, different values, different visions of the future, and these narratives compete with each other. Okay, so now let's bring this all together. If Pax Americana is ending, what comes next is not a new empire. It's not a clean transition. It's a messy, fragmented, volatile system where multiple powers interact, compete, and sometimes cooperate. And this is where most people misunderstand the situation. They think in terms of replacement. They think if one system ends, another must take its place. But history doesn't always work that way. Sometimes systems collapse into complexity. Sometimes order gives way to disorder, and sometimes that disorder becomes the new normal. All right. So what does this mean for the United States? It means that it will still be a major power. It will still have enormous influence, but it will no longer be able to define the system. It will have to operate within it like everyone else. And that's a very different position, because when you define the system, you set the rules, but when you operate within it, you have to adapt, you have to negotiate, you have to compromise. Okay. So now the final question: how does this transition actually happen? Does it happen suddenly? Does it happen through a major crisis? Or does it happen gradually? And the answer is that it's already happening through small shifts, through incremental changes, through decisions made by countries responding to uncertainty. Each decision on its own seems minor, but together they reshape the system. And by 2027, what you will see is not the end of Pax Americana as a single event, but the recognition that it has already ended. People will look back and say, this is the moment when the system changed. But in reality, the change will have been happening for years. All right. So to conclude, the end of Pax Americana does not mean the end of American power. It means the end of a certain kind of order, a certain kind of stability, a certain kind of predictability. And what comes next is something more complex, more fragmented, and more uncertain. And the question is not whether this transition will happen. The question is how different countries will adapt to it. Because in a fragmented world, adaptation becomes the key to survival. And those who fail to adapt, those who cling to the old system, those who assume that the rules have not changed will find themselves increasingly isolated. All right? So that is how this ends. Not with a collapse, not with a replacement, but with a transformation. And by the time most people realize it, it will already be too late to go.